Okay.
And we'll be recording this through the presentations and Q&A. We probably don't have to record the business meeting materials, but go ahead, Mike McClarty.
Great, thanks, John, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight on our first of 5 ESFPA regional meetings. And this year, like last year, we are going digital again. Well, this wasn't our intended outcome when we set about planning for these meetings. With the uncertainty that currently exists, we thought it prudent to go virtual. And while we would have loved to see everybody in person and shake hands, with that not being possible, what the staff has done, and I'm tremendously proud of them, is put together another excellent set of virtual regional meetings with, I think, what you'll find is some really interesting speakers. You know, the purpose of tonight's meeting is kind of threefold. One is to reconnect. We don't often get a chance to reach out to our entire membership, and tonight is that opportunity. 2, we do want to conduct a little bit of business and elect or some new board members. And 3, the purpose of tonight's meeting is what the purpose of the ESFPA is, and that is to provide value for our membership. I will remind you, and I just want to stress that word value, because we are your organization. When I say your, we're talking about the membership. We represent the interests of the forest products industry, including landowners, foresters, loggers, and many other participants. And we're only as strong as the feedback we get from our membership. And tonight is one of those nights where you can give us feedback. Again, it's your organization. We work for you, and we're only as strong as the participation that everybody puts in. And so when I think about that participation value, I think there is a couple groups I want to say thank you to. First, to our staff, John, Joanne, Muriel. You know, honestly, we couldn't ask for a better staff, and you guys are wonderful, and I can't, speak enough to the great job you've done. I also want to thank my fellow board members. We have an excellent board. Everybody puts time and effort in and provides a lot of leadership, and without that our strong board, I don't think we would get as much done as we do. And then finally, our membership. Again, we're only as strong as our membership. And it is truly amazing what our membership does each day, the obstacles they overcome, and how they just generally represent our industry and the great community we have. And so thank you. Lastly, as I extend thanks, I do want to extend thanks to our speakers tonight and acknowledge and thank our speakers that are yet to come over the next couple of weeks. You guys are certainly a big part of these regional meetings, and we look forward to your insight and information you present. So, John, if I could, I'm going to pass things over back to you, and we'll get on with the meeting.
Sure, and thank you everyone, and welcome again for the 117th also annual meeting of ESFPA. But at first, I'm going to have Muriel go over some Zoom protocol so you can interact with us this evening.
Good evening, everybody. I also just want to bring to everybody's attention the remaining 4 regional meetings that we have. Actually, 3 of them are regional meetings. And again, even if it's not your region, you're very welcome, and we would love to have you participate. You just need to register. We have one tomorrow night, October 4th and October 5th. And then October 7th is our full annual meeting. Again, virtual, all are welcome. So just a little protocol for tonight. And someone had asked a question inside our chat. The way that it works is we don't have an open audio, but when you go through the chat function and have a question for me, or if you text me, and my phone number is listed right up here on the screen, I can release you to speak to the panelists or anyone else on the one at a time. So that's how the webinar question works. So you can send either a private message or a group message, and I'll see it, and I'll make sure it's asked, and then I'll open up your line of audio. And the next thing I would like to do as we move along is bring up Mark Mowry, the chair of the New York State Log and Load for Kids.
Is there any more introduction, Muriel, or is it up to me from here?
You're on, Mark.
You're on, Mark. As well for you.
I thought I'd unmuted.
You're good. I can hear you.
Now you're muted.
John can hear me? Can Muriel hear me?
Yes,
I can
we
hear
can.
you, Mark.
Okay, all right. I haven't done this in a couple months, so I'm rusty. First of all, we'd like to ask everybody to take a look at the email updates that Muriel sends on Log-a-Load for Kids. We've got some new ideas for this year. It's a struggle without active things like the Woodsman's Field Days and parades and carnivals where we can meet people face to face and get foot traffic to raise money. So I'm asking people to try to help share what they see on the ESFPA emails and take it larger through your own organization so more people are aware of the Log-a-Load for Kids campaign, what we do for Children's Miracle Network hospitals, and we raise money literally $1 or $2 at a time. So it's been tough with COVID to raise money. I didn't think we would do well last year when we normally did $32,000 to $33,000 a year. I thought we'd be lucky if we raised $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. We raised $27,000 last year statewide. It was unbelievable how generous people were. We're off to a slow start this year, but we are asking people to give consideration. First of all, ask your organization, have your organization donate. A lot of our largest donations come from corporate or company donations by simply writing a check to your regional Log-a-Load for Kids. We direct the money to your closest Children's Miracle Network hospital. So first of all, donate. Second of all, participate and encourage your employees and your coworkers and loggers, truckers. We have chainsaw raffles. We have a Venmo system with the Dave Drive. We've got 2 chainsaws right now that are up there, one from CJ Logging and another from GKS Sales. These are professional full-size chainsaws that are up for raffle for $5 at a whack. This year, we have tried to raise money in memory of Dave Miller, who was one of our stalwart volunteers at Boonville. He was the 2012 National Log-a-Load or National Game of Logging champion for landowner division. And he was very proud to be part of the timber industry. We lost him to cancer this winter. We're asking people to pony up for the Dave Drive because we have another guy that read our letter. Dave Tergaskis is willing to match dollar for dollar every dollar we raise above last year's total of $27,000. So if we can somehow raise $32,000, Dave Tergaskis will put in $5,000 more, dollar for dollar, whatever we can get above last year's total of $27,000. We have the chainsaw raffles, which go till the end of this month. We have some firewood auctions. We've got 3 loads of firewood donated from Gutchess Lumber, Green Lumber Company, and Pat Reagan and his wife Karen have donated a load. That's in the Camden area. The Gutchess load naturally would be 50 miles from Cortland, and the Davenport would be somewhere. The Green Lumber load would be 50 miles from Davenport, but they're sold to the highest bidder. They're full triaxle loads of firewood. If your organization would like to donate a load of firewood, that would be good. We'll try to get it up, get it publicized, and have more auctions. In the fall, once we get past these 2 activities with chainsaws, in November, we'd like to have some craft auctions going towards the Christmas holidays. If you are a woodworker or you've got skills with anything you like to make and would like to donate, we'll put it up. on a site, and we'll auction it off for log a load for kids. I ask you, consider running a fundraiser at your own organization. You know, do a cornhole tournament. I know there's some people up north in Saranac Lake that are going to have a loggers trivia night next Thursday. And anything you can do to ask loggers, truckers. I know Jen DeFrancisco does a tremendous amount of fundraising at B&B Forest Products by asking loggers to simply donate to log a load for kids, the value of a log or part of the value of a load. And then B&B Forest Products matches that, and they matched thousands of dollars worth of log a load donations over the last 4 or 5 years. And just throwing the pitch out there for the kids. Thank you, everybody, for listening to me.
Thank you, Mark.
If I could just add for that, just if you all see that there's a Venmo, and you can Venmo your donation to log a load, and in the note section, just say what you'd like to Venmo it specifically for, and we'll be able to do that.
And that information is also on our website.
Yes, it is.
So, well, let's move on to our feature this evening. I want to thank Colin Byer, Tristan Brown, and Tim Volk from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry for joining us. These three researchers are among the top climate researchers in New York State, and certainly have been very active over the past couple of years on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and advocating for forests and harvested wood products, along with many of us. So we really appreciate them taking their time. I'll do a quick brief introduction for each one who's about to go. I'm going to start with Colin. And Colin Byer is an associate professor of ecology in the Sustainable Resource Management Department at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and one of the founding principals of the Climate Applied Forestry Research Institute. Colin's going to give us a very brief synopsis of CAFRE's New York Forest Carbon Assessment Project, which is being supported by the Department of Environmental Conservation with a focus on new data maps and tools developed to enable statewide assessment and monitoring of forest lands and their climate benefits. This is going to be a critical amount of monitoring and reporting on the ability of our forests to store carbon and sequester carbon, and will be critical as we move forward to CLCPA implementation. So Colin, please go ahead. You can share.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, John. Can everybody see the first slide there?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm going to jump right in. As John mentioned, I'll try to give a very quick overview here, and really with a focus on our objectives and some examples of the ends without getting too much into the means of this, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone individually or in groups and talk more about how we got to some of these products and so forth. So our objective in this assessment is to develop really a map-based carbon accounting system for natural and working lands, forests, farms, and wetlands across New York State. As many of us know, there's a real fuzzy line in some cases between forests and some other types of lands that we have in the state, some of them former farmlands, some of them wetlands that are in various states of development or post-development. But this is meant to not only inform policy and regulatory actions pursuant to the climate law, but also in hopes of supporting forest stewardship activities more broadly. Just to give a little bit of background, the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis, or FIA program, reports state-level estimates of carbon stocks and changes on forest land to the EPA based on the statistical analysis from their plot network, the FIA plot network, of which there's about 4,500 plots across New York State. And those state-level stocks and trend estimates are very useful. But what we found in conversations, especially over the last couple of years, is as we look at that high-level single number and set of numbers statewide, it doesn't offer a lot in the way of actionable information at the scales relevant to where decisions are made, particularly at the parcel scale. But even at a regional level, a lot of times there's some limited insights on from this information on why, where, how the forest carbon sink might be changing. And so we really set out to implement this type of thing in a map space, which is really a lot more valuable on a number of levels and a lot more information rich, but obviously has a number of challenges. So we set out to create a map-based inventory of current forest carbon stocks that is statewide, wall-to-wall, high resolution, and accurate enough to provide reliable estimates for accounting, as well as for other purposes that can be scaled from the parcel level to the state or regional levels. And then a system for using the field plots and satellite and other data to both be able to estimate how carbon stocks have changed historically, going back to 1990, which gives us those stocks changes, gives us a sense of where things have been, to understanding sequestrations and emissions, as well as looking forward in time, monitoring both the carbon stock changes across New York State from 2020 onward. The deliverables that we have include data and maps and a lot of different kind of tools mixed together into this space for leveraging these products into both public and private sector decision making. And so it's not enough just to produce some of this, but we need to make sure that it translates to decision making and into a variety of spaces. And I just want to say this once, and I'll say it again at the end, or hopefully indicate it at the end, but one of the key principles guiding us in this is that working forests will play a really vital role in addressing the climate goals of the state. And these forests have to be assessed fairly and with attention to the privacy and confidentiality issues of some of the data that we're developing. So a really short way of saying this is that CAFRE is mapping the current forest biomass and carbon stocks, which is shown here in the green box, estimating recent patterns of changes in carbon stocks going backward in time in the blue box, and then monitoring future patterns of changes in carbon stocks, which is that orange box to the right, for all of New York State. So we're developing a map-based current inventory. We're really leveraging a lot of the FIA network as well as available large-scale leaf-off LiDAR or laser altimetry. These are airborne LiDAR coverages. And just to give you some examples of the types of products that we're generating for current biomass, what this map shows is above ground biomass, and based on that biomass, we can estimate all of the forest carbon pools, with the exception of forest soils, which, as many of you may know, is a tricky one, and is one that we are looking at, but we have been really focused more on the biomass aspects of this as it relates to forest land use. But essentially, we're mapping these areas at about a 30-meter resolution. So each of those little pixels in this map, portions of the North Country and Lake George area, each one of those pixels is 30 by 30 meters on the ground. And I'm showing the water here in blue and the developed areas in red. And just to give you a sense of, we have mapped much of the state. We're waiting on some delayed LiDAR, but to give you a sense of some of these current maps, a very different landscape in the Finger Lakes and Tug Hill area and the lake plain of the Cayuga and Oswego County. Not nearly as much forest as we know. Down in the southern tier in Allegheny-Steuben area. And each of these LiDAR coverages was flown at different times. So there's a lot of work, I won't get into it, to be able to harmonize these and bring them all up to 2019, 2020, which is important for kind of understanding the current snapshot of stocks. And then we look at the lower Hudson Valley, as we know, real interesting contrast between the Catskills and the upper kind of northwestern corner of this map. And of course, the much more developed areas in the lower Hudson. We also have to be able to take these maps and carry them backwards in time and then be able to assess the changes over time on a pixel by pixel basis, essentially to be able to track those changes as best we can. And we've developed some additional models building on the LiDAR based biomass models that I just showed you to be able to look at historical changes over time. And what I'm going to attempt to show you here is just a movie. Essentially, this is stepping through year by year in these frames of these changes in biomass that we're observing over time. And at this scale, it's really kind of hard to see what's going on. And I'm going to zoom in here in a minute. But essentially what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that we have this ability to create these annual maps that we can then continue to refine and use to understand not only forest changes in biomass, but land use land cover changes, including the loss of forest, which is a very important issue, I think, as we all know. To to step forward here, if we zoom into an area, and let me go back really quickly, this red square here, this is area adjacent to Huntington Forest, the ESF College property in Newcomb, the Upper Hudson Woodlands area, which was acquired by the state, or I'm sorry, it was part of the former Finch Prine lands that was not acquired by the state, that is being managed by F&W Forestry. Just to show you here, this area, here's Route 28N and Fishing Brook. And essentially what we can do is track over time. And in this map, you can see some more areas of harvesting, including a seed tree that came in here in the 90s, as well as some other harvests that were done over time. And you can see these changing. And what this movie is showing is the total amount of estimated above ground biomass as we move through this time series. And I'll play it just again so that you can see that again. Again, the movies are really just a way of illustrating that we have a lot of this information and we can look at how these things are changing over time. We can not only assess the changes in biomass that may be associated with working forests, but we can also demonstrate and prove the regeneration of the land, which is obviously very important for maintaining carbon stocks, particularly in the soils. And so we have the ability to be able to track this over time historically, and the very similar system is in place in a fundamental way for being able to ingest new satellite imagery and do monitoring of the landscape going forward. So in the monitoring question, we're looking forward now as we get new data each year. How is the landscape changing and what does this mean for the forest carbon sink? This is obviously a very significant, great significance to the climate legislation. And the reality is, as Bob Malmsheimer and others have said, that we need to, the state's very ambitious goals is relying on the forest land, probably going to need to more than double the size of the forest carbon sink over the next 30 years, which is a big task that's going to fall on a lot of the shoulders of landowners and others. This is a really critical issue to be able to monitor change over time and then understand the nature of that change as it not only relates to forest carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions, but also as it relates to current and potential future programs, including conservation easements, carbon offset programs, et cetera. What I'm showing you here is some recent harvesting that took place on Huntington Forest. And as many of you probably know, that we harvest timber on the land is primarily for educational demonstration and research purposes, but a lot of different demonstration of different harvest methods here from 2019. And what I'm showing you is the photo on the right from the NAPE imagery right after those cuts were put in the winter of 1819. On the left, what I'm showing is 3 different algorithms that are processing Landsat imagery to tell you where disturbances have happened. And the fact that these are off-the-shelf algorithms, these are data products that exist out there that the state could potentially use for monitoring, just grabbing one of them and doing them. And what we found is they actually don't, none of them have been developed or tuned for northern hardwood forests, or really for eastern deciduous forests, or for uneven age management practices, which are pretty common, obviously, in much of the Northeast. And what we found, and I apologize, this slide's a little off, but that, you know, we believe that the working forests really need to have fair and accurate monitoring, and the existing tools are not up to the task right now. And so we've done some ground truthing working with F&W Forestry, and they've shared some of their land use records from the Upper Hudson Woodlands, some of their management records since 2010. And we also have the ESF Forest property records. And essentially what we've seen is that these tools are not ready for prime time, and that they're not consistently detecting harvests. They also detect a lot of other disturbances that may be unrelated to harvest, and we need to be able to help the state parse these things out so that natural disturbances that occur on working forest lands don't get credited as harvest. And so the more harvest records that we have that folks are willing to share, the better we can ground truth these algorithms, and the better we can engage to tune them and train them so they do a better job. And that's something, if you're interested in helping, John suggested that I would at least put that plug in there to see if anyone would like to share. And please reach out to Wayne Tripp and Steve Logan at F&W. We've got and ask them how they felt about how we've managed the data and the relationship. It's been a great partnership. They've been really generous. The last thing I want to mention, and John has stressed this for me over time, and is that we respect the privacy and confidentiality of the landowners and recognize your legitimate concerns with respect to CLCPA. I certainly, having spent quite a bit of time in the Adirondacks, and before that coming here from the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, I get the politics. I understand that we need to be thoughtful about how we share this information, and not even your land use records, just the maps that we're producing. They're detailed enough to understand what's going on a parcel level, especially for the large industrial parcels. I will say that we currently manage multiple data sets that are sensitive and confidential, including the true plot locations for FIA, which I had to auction off one of my future children to be able to get permission from them to have, but also the New York State parcel records, as well as the stuff that Wayne and Steve at F&W have shared with us. We use a lot of encryption and other measures to secure our servers, databases, and local machines. Now, you're asking yourself, well, he's doing this for DEC, so every DEC is going to get everything. Well, many of you know Rob Davies, and so I'm not going to say that I won't give Rob anything, because obviously I'm going to give Rob things, but we're operating with state funding via DEC and partnering with the Office of Climate Change and with Rob Shop with Lands and Forests to ensure the security and confidentiality of the map and data products. There is a difference between the raw data internal to our databases and then the things that we kind of curate and customize and push out to the various partners and decision makers and agencies, and even in some cases in a public space. But those things they're separate, and so we can really carefully manage what goes out there and to whom. We're working on developing a data use agreement, building on the New York Natural Heritage Programs model, and we'd like to incorporate feedback from this group and others to the extent we can. Now, as you know, the lawyers dictate a lot of these things, and I can't tell them one way or the other. The last thing I'll say is we don't anticipate that everything that we're doing is just going to be handed over to DEC. They can't manage it. They don't have the staff to manage it. They also can be exposed to FOIA requests, whereas as an academic institution, we are protected from those FOIA requests as it relates to research activities. And we have a very secure cloud-based data infrastructure that we're building so that it's not just the data's locked up, but that we can provide access to it on the fly, rapidly responding to questions and queries and needs. So I apologize, John, for going a little over time. I hope I touched the key points here. Thank you so much for listening. I apologize for also going very quickly, but hope that covers it.
You did a perfect summary of what's here. I'm gonna keep going on to our next speaker, but I do want to mention that Colin and I are discussing possibly doing a deeper dive into this data process in November, maybe, where we could get some forest landowners together and really go a little bit deeper. It gets really technical and wonky, but there's lots of questions that I know Colin has and others have, and it'd be great to have landowners help verify some of those. So moving on, our next speaker is Tristan Brown. Tristan is an associate professor of energy resource economics at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He also serves on the New York Climate Action Council's Energy Intensive and Trade Exposed Industries Advisory Panel and a bioenergy subgroup. Tristan's presentation will discuss some strategic role that forest-based bioenergy may play in New York when the CLCPA is implemented and in the very near future. So go ahead, Tristan. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. Can everyone see my slides okay? Title slide? Great. So yeah, as John noted, I'm working very closely with a couple of the different advisory panels on the CLCPA. And really the big debate that we have been seeing for the last year is what role is bioenergy going to play in this? What role, if any? Of course, when the CLCPA was implemented, a lot of people read the legislation and saw that there seemed to be a very anti-biomass bias in it, especially with regard to bioenergy. And things have come a long way since then. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what's going on with that and really the role that the Climate Action Council is currently discussing. And we expect to, ideally see a decision made by the end of the year. Let's see if I can move my slides. There we go. So yeah, just, I think most people here are familiar with the CLCPA, but just, brief overview. Ultimately, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, CLCPA, requires New York State to achieve the deep decarbonization of its economy by 2050. And when we say deep decarbonization, we mean that this is really unprecedented. This is, certainly it was billed when this legislation was passed as the world's most ambitious climate change legislation. Now, I think some other states like California might, dispute that, whether it's the most ambitious, but it is definitely up there. So, for example, by 2040, the power sector has to achieve 100% decarbonization. Our power sector needs to be 100% renewable electricity by 2040. So that's very ambitious target, right? Because we're talking less than 20 years. The overall economy needs to achieve an 85% reduction to its greenhouse gas emissions. So this is where things really become truly ambitious, because most policies that we've seen in the past have focused on the power sector, to a lesser extent on the transportation sector. The CLCPA covers everything. So building energy, waste, everything is covered. And then, 85% reduction is kind of the minimum target. The legislation also provides, it encourages state lawmakers to achieve 100% reduction overall, with the additional 15% being achieved via offsets. Now, it's optional. You may have heard people, especially some of the downstate environmental groups, saying it has to be 100% of the entire economy. That is not true. It's just 85%, but there is the option to go to 100% should the state decide to do so. So this is going to impact just about every single aspect of the state, which is going to make it very notable in that regard. Now, the other thing, because of the fact that this covers the entire economy, it's worth just noting where this is going to be focused on. We again tend to think things like power, the electric power sector. New York State, nearly half of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. And so when we talk about deep decarbonization, this means every aspect of the transportation sector is going to be impacted. So when you're talking about logging operations, especially when you're talking about the heavy duty trucks that are going to be hauling logs, other products from point A to point B, these are going to have to achieve deep decarbonization as part of this. Logging operations are going to require deep decarbonization. So this is going to be impacting every aspect of our economy. And because transportation is such a big aspect of it, that is really going to be, I think, the most difficult target. Because at the end of the day, and this is where the forest industry, there's also a potential opportunity here. This means jet fuel, right? So it's not just everyone buys an electric vehicle and we're set. This is going to be everything, all the way to the fuel that we're using in our airplanes when we're flying is going to need to be deep decarbonized. So this is going to require a great many changes to technologies, to the ways that we use biomass. This is going to be very different than anything that anyone has done in the past. And the main reason for that is electricity can only replace so much. And especially when, if we're just thinking about the transportation sector, for example, since that is our largest source of emissions, ultimately only 43% of every barrel of petroleum is converted to gasoline. Gasoline is the only fossil fuel in the transportation sector that we can currently relatively easily replace with electricity, right? So when you think of a Tesla, that is ultimately displacing gasoline. But we still have over 50% of every barrel of petroleum is going to other products like diesel fuel, products like jet fuel. And then really where it gets very difficult is when you start talking products that you're not actually going to be combusting. So these are going to be things like polymers, so plastics, things even like asphalt. We're going to have to figure out how to stop using those. And so diesel fuel, residual fuel, and jet fuel are things that we're going to have to find a way to replace and ultimately decarbonize those. But we're not going to be doing that with electricity anytime soon. And so this is where the big opportunity for biomass in New York State comes into play. And I would say this is probably the main reason that despite everything that was included in the specific legislation with the CLCPA, biomass and bioenergy are going to have a very important and a very strategic role to play between now and 2050. Because, the fact of the matter, what I always tell my students is if you were to power your standard commercial airliner with batteries, so if you were to power it with electricity alone, it would not take off. The plane would be simply too heavy because of all the batteries. Batteries have terrible, terrible energy density. And so the plane would not be able to leave the ground. And so this is why we're going to have to find replacements for things like that. Think about residual fuel, bunker fuel that we use in the shipping industry. We're not going to be using electricity to replace that. And diesel fuel, maybe we'll have electricity replacing that in the next 20 years. But when you look at the state of heavy duty vehicle electrification, it's at a very infant stage. It's going to require a lot of development before we start replacing those. So the CLCPA's targets will only be accomplished, especially with regard to the transportation sector, if we rely on something other than electricity. And so that's really where the role for biomass, and especially when we start thinking about forest resources, that's going to have a very important role to play under the CLCPA moving forward. The big one that we're most likely going to see some form or another, and there's a lot of debate going on about this in New York State, but California is about 10 years ahead of New York in this regard. So it's worth mentioning what California has done in the transportation sector to decarbonize. California has a low carbon fuel standard. And so, it's pretty minor compared to what New York State is going to try to do, because by 2030, it only requires a 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And this slide here is showing, right, it's a gradual reduction, but it's been going on since 2011. And the low carbon fuel standard essentially incentivizes or provides a subsidy for low carbon fuels to be introduced into the transportation sector. And that subsidy is a direct function of the carbon intensity reduction of those fuels compared to a fossil fuel. And so this is something I mentioned California because it's had a lot of success with this. California has really led the way in terms of transportation decarbonization. And so we're probably going to see something, if not identical to this, something similar deployed in New York State. And so the reason I say that, New York is currently considering, and this is 2019, but each legislative session it's being considered is considering what it calls a clean fuel standard, which would functionally be very similar to the low carbon fuel standard that's been deployed in California. And so the idea is, especially when we start thinking about these, these hard to electrify fuels, this is where we would start to see potentially lignocellulosic biomass come into a very big way. And then even if the legislature doesn't pass it, as part of the CLCPA process itself, last spring, the advisory panels for the Climate Action Council developed a large number, several hundred, I believe, policy recommendations, essentially saying, okay, here are the policies that should be used in New York State to enable us to reach the decarbonization targets. And as part of that, the Transportation Advisory Panel recommended a clean fuel standard. And this is being taken very seriously by DEC and NYSERDA. They are currently analyzing this closely. If you've seen any of the recent Climate Action Council meetings, they've talked about how a clean fuel standard is actually one of the dozen or so policy recommendations that they are explicitly mentioning that they are currently analyzing. So there's a very good chance, even if the legislature were not to do something, we would see something like a clean fuel standard employed in New York State via the regulatory process rather than the legislative process. The reason I refer to California is what California has had a tremendous amount of success doing is replacing these heavy duty fuels. Biomass-based diesel generates almost 50% of all the carbon credits being generated under California's low carbon fuel standard. When I say biomass-based diesel, that's diesel fuel, right? So you're talking replacements for diesel fuel, but biomass-based diesel, it's very easy to use that as heating oil. In fact, here in New York State, we have a bioheat mandate that many of you have probably heard of, which is blending biodiesel with our heating oil, because we do use a fair bit of heating oil here in the state as well. And then ultimately, if you're able to produce biomass-based diesel, you are able to produce renewable jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel. And so California's success doing this is really why New York State is moving in that direction, because California has shown the technology is not nearly as risky as you might expect it to be. The reason this has happened, and I think it's very important when we start thinking about what it's going to take for New York to achieve its deep decarbonization targets, is using fuels that have a very low carbon intensity relative to fossil fuels. And so we've got petroleum there on the left, you've got bio-based jet fuel, you've got biodiesel, renewable diesel. All three of those currently are primarily being produced from lipid feedstocks. So things like used cooking oil, animal tallow. But the last one on there, the one that has the lowest carbon intensity of all the fuels that are being analyzed, cellulosic diesel. This is where you actually in California, they are converting forest residues, and it's actually as part of their forest fire mitigation, the wildfire mitigation efforts. They're converting forest residues to a biofuel. It's a diesel fuel. And so this is actually going to be very attractive in California moving forward because of how low that carbon intensity is. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to low carbon fuels, it is very difficult to compete on a carbon intensity basis with anything that you're producing from forest residue and other sources of lignocellulosic biomass. And this data here coming out of California just shows that. Now, I mentioned that California is ultimately the value of the subsidy that it provides is a direct function of the carbon intensity reduction compared to fossil fuels. Right now in California, that cellulosic diesel gets a subsidy equivalent to about $2 per gallon. Okay, so this is on top of the energy value of the fuel, right? So if you're paying $3 per gallon for the fuel already, you get a subsidy of $2 on top of that. This is the reason that in California, we are seeing a tremendous amount of investment in converting forest residues to low carbon fuels, because $2 per gallon is a tremendous profit margin. And at this point, it's pretty much all profit margin, or at least a very substantial fraction of it is. And so this is really driving a lot of heavy investment in California. Just to give you examples, so this was an effort by ExxonMobil, company that everyone's of course familiar with, and a renewable fuels producer, Renewable Energy Group, partnering to advance cellulosic biofuel research. The whole idea here was to take forest residue, convert it to sugars, and then ferment those sugars into biodiesel. So this was a different type of lignocellulosic biomass being converted to diesel, but it was still something that would certainly fall within that category. This is one, there's actually a couple different projects, and this is one that's going on out in California. This is being funded by the California Energy Commission. They're actually building these little thermochemical processing facilities that convert forest residue. And again, this is part of their wildfire prevention effort, converting forest residue to lignocellulosic diesel. And then they're actually using that in logging industry and other rural applications. So this is something that they're currently moving forward with as well. And then this is a more recent one. I guess I shouldn't say recent, it's about 3 years old at this point, but just gives you an idea as to the dollar figures being considered here. This is a cellulosic ethanol project in California, $158 million project. And again, they're using lignocellulosic biomass, in this case, converting it to ethanol, but wide variety of fuels that you could actually convert to. And so we're seeing very rapid scale up in California, taking forest residues, converting it to these low carbon fuels, because of a policy that we will most likely see in some form or another here in New York State in the relatively near future. So just to wrap this up, in terms of conclusions, CLCPA is going to require the rapid and thorough decarbonization of New York State's transportation sector, right? Again, this is the largest source of our emissions, so this is going to be a very big effort. New York State is currently far behind other states, and really when I say other states, I mean most other large states. It's very far behind the rest of the country on transportation decarbonization progress, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And as a result, we're basically starting from zero, right? We're going to have to scale this up very rapidly. And this decarbonization that's going to occur for the transportation sector, it's going to require the use of biomass to mitigate emissions from these hard to electrify sources, such as diesel fuel, bunker fuel, and jet fuel. And so that's really going to be the role for biomass moving forward, and especially lignocellulosic feedstocks like forest residue is these hard to electrify emissions. California's low carbon fuel standard has driven commercialization of second generation low carbon technologies, including biofuels from forest biomass. And so it's shown us what can be done, and it's shown us how rapidly this type of process can be scaled up. And so forest biomass will be playing an important role in New York State if we're going to achieve the CLCPA's targets. Since these are very ambitious targets, this is something that's going to have to occur quickly. When we see these targets going out to 2050, the general expectation is that by 2030, we need to have fully commercialized producing things like diesel fuel and jet fuel from lignocellulosic biomass if we're going to succeed in achieving these 2050 targets. So with that, have my email address up here. Certainly feel free to shoot me any questions. I know we're going to have some time for Q&A after this as well. And so I will turn it over to John again. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. Appreciate that. And we'll keep going on our presentations and then come back to Q&A. Our next presenter is Tim Volk. Tim is a professor and associate chair at the Department of Sustainable Resource Management at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. His research focuses on the development of woody biomass as a feedstock for bioproducts and bioenergy, sustainability assessments of bioenergy systems and agroforestry. If somebody could just please mute. And then Tim is leading a New York wood bio-based economy project that will start later this fall. And this evening, he'll discuss what a bioeconomy is and how it may look in New York going forward. So Tim, please.
Great, John, thanks for the opportunity to come and share with you. And it was great to have Colin and Tristan go in advance because it really sets up nicely what it is that I'm going to be chatting about here this evening. So what I want to talk to you about a few minutes is the idea of a bio-based economy for here in New York. And Tristan really queued it up well in the context of the CLCPA, but also as an example of biomass-based diesel, renewable diesel, right, as an example product that could come out. So first, I'm going to talk about what the bioeconomy is. So this is a new term that's become much more common. It started 20 or 25 years ago. People started talking about this idea. And there's lots of variation in definitions. So you can look around and find it described in different ways in different places. Federal agencies don't agree on it. I'm going to use this definition from the Biomass Research and Development Board that I have listed here. All of these things are really driven by the need to address climate change and the concern that as we address climate change, we also need to be concerned about maintaining and growing our economies. So what is the Biomass Research and Development Board? It's really an interagency board made up by a whole bunch of different federal agencies: Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Interior, Department of Transportation, EPA is involved, the FAA is involved with aviation fuels, the Navy's involved because they're interested in low carbon fuels, and NSF, the National Science Foundation. So it's really a cross-cutting effort to try and address issues related to biomass, right? And so here is their definition on the screen of what the bioeconomy is. So I've underlined a couple of things that I want to highlight as I go through this. So it's really using renewable aquatic and terrestrial biomass to make different products, right? They could be energy products, they could be intermediate products that go on to something else, or they could be final products that go right into the market directly, right? And then this idea of capturing economic, social, and national security benefits. The bioeconomy is really, it's a broad concept generally. Everybody, all the stakeholders, all the way from the forest landowners, all through the harvesting, processing, transportation, shipping, converting it into end products, delivering it to the market and consumers at the other end. So when people talk about the bioeconomy, it's fairly all-inclusive along that supply chain. So just some data. A few years ago, the US Department of Energy did this assessment of how much biomass could be produced here in the US. And they came up with an assessment that showed that we could produce 1 billion tons with a B of biomass sustainably across the country. And I'm going to show you a map of where they project some of that occurring. But if we took that biomass and turned it into products, chemicals, fuels, et cetera, right? What kind of impacts might that have on the economy, right? So over 1 million direct jobs, right? 50 billion gallons of biofuels that would, at the 2016 levels, would replace about 25% of this nation's transportation fuels, 50 billion pounds of chemicals and other products, and then large CO2 reductions that occur in association with that. So at a federal level, right, these are the kind of assessments that have been done. Where does that biomass come from? Well, here's a snapshot. Myself. Okay.
Yep, sorry.
So here's a snapshot of potential biomass resources in the country. Okay, so the red, this is by county. So it's, you know, it's a little bit skewed with larger counties in some parts of the country, but the highest amounts per county are in red. This is largely agricultural residues in the middle of the country, but you can see that New York State, large areas of this are dark blue, light blue, the next couple of levels in terms of biomass availability. And a big chunk of this has to do with the forest biomass resource that Colin talked about and is doing lots of work to assess. So New York State certainly got potential, and I'll come back and zoom in on that in a minute in terms of where we are at in terms of biomass, potential biomass resources. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, right? The idea of sustainability and sustainable use of the biomass supply in the bioeconomy is key in almost all definitions, right? And I'll just really highlight it from the fact that we need to find that sweet spot between environmental, social, and economic components, right, to find that sweet spot for sustainability. So this does need to be done in a way that companies can make money and stay in business and pay their workers and all those other things, in addition to the environmental and social aspects as well. I just want to stop and remind us that trees are amazing. I mean, I think all of us understand that and appreciate that, but one way to think about trees is that they're really solar powered chemical factories, right? So, just amazing what happens. Put in a little water, pull some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, add some sunlight, lots of complicated processes going on inside the leaves and the trees, and you get oxygen coming out, and you get all sorts of here labeled sugars, but all sorts of complex compounds and molecules, right? You're starting with carbon dioxide and water, pretty simple stuff. And you end up with, here on the right side, are examples of the main components, right? Cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, right? Then there's a whole bunch of other extractors and things that trees make. These are incredibly complex compounds, right? And this is where what Tristan was talking about in terms of being able to take woody biomass, right? And get at these complex compounds, take it apart wisely in an intelligent way and pull out those compounds and then apply them and do a little bit of chemical engineering and turn them into products that we want to use, for example, in the transportation industry. Okay, so that's why biomass is appealing, right? The trees are making these complex compounds for us. We just got to figure out how to recover them, right, in a way that's cost effective and gets us to where we want to go in terms of end products. Okay, so let's talk about a wood-based bioeconomy. Other places talk about bioeconomies that include all sorts of other biomass resources. It could be municipal solid waste, it could be algae, it could be agricultural residues, it could be herbaceous materials. But I'm just going to talk about wood-based bioeconomy products. So key is, when we talk about this, this is in addition to all the conventional wood products that are already being made, right? So we already have a wood-based bioeconomy in essence here in New York State, and we don't want to do away with that. What we want to do is we want to build on this, right? And in some cases, these may be higher value products. And as Tristan just emphasized, right, if there's prices for carbon and renewable fuels, right, then there's money to be made by making other products. But these are the kind of things that are typical, right, in wood-based bioeconomies. This is from British Columbia, the government of British Columbia, right? This is a list that they put together there. One of the things we'll do over the next few months is in this project is create these kind of lists on what the greatest potential is for doing things here in New York State. All of these products either sequester carbon, right? So think about mass timber. We're pulling CO2 out of the air. You turn it into wood. You put that wood in a building. It's sequestered there for decades or maybe centuries, right? Other things like advanced biofuels, right, are not sequestering that carbon for as long a period of time, because once that's burned, that carbon dioxide goes back to the atmosphere. But they are offsetting fossil fuels that we're using in the process. And Tristan showed you some of those carbon benefits in a previous slide. Okay, again, this is a screenshot from the government in British Columbia, right? As I think about the project we're getting ready to launch, this is the kind of information I think we want to figure out for New York State, right? So there's multiple sources of biomass, bark, branches, tops, right? There may be some pulpwood that's available out there, saw logs. Some of this is going to go to conventional products, and then there's some of this material out of here that comes off as residues, right? That could be used for other products, okay? That might feed into the bioeconomy. So it's really using all the parts of the resources that are available, right? And making all sorts of different products here as part of the bioeconomy. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a bioeconomy. We have a wood-based bioeconomy. I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about this. You folks all know this as well as anybody in the state, right? Here's numbers from the assessment from a couple of years ago in terms of the impact of this economy, right? In terms of industry products, recreation benefits, jobs, right? It's been in decline in the last few years, right? But this is important. We do not want to go and build a wood-based bioeconomy here in New York State and ignore what already has been built and is being maintained, right? We want to support that and then grow it further. So can we do that? Are there forest biomass resources in New York? Yeah, I showed you the national map before. This is a detailed analysis that was done as part of a project with NYSERDA about a decade ago. Colin's going to even have better numbers from his assessments, right? But there is certainly potential for growth while supporting the existing industry. The assessment that we ran in this project for NYSERDA showed that there's somewhere around 8.5 million dry tons a year of additional biomass. It could be as high as 14. At that number between 8 and 14 really depends upon land management. So 8.5 is at the conservative end, assuming that only a certain portion of the landscape comes under management and gets harvested. It's got a bunch of sustainability guidelines in here. That's more than I want to get into. But the key is there is lots of additional biomass growing in the forest, right, that we could harvest without having an impact on the overall standing carbon across the landscape. The other thing that people are looking at and needs to be assessed, right, is the unused portions of the wood supply, right, and recycling wood-based materials into some of these processes as part of developing the wood-based bioeconomy going forward. I just wanted to mention one program that has, over the last few years, sort of taken off quite a bit, and there's a lot of attention around this, and there's increasingly money being put into this. So this is the Bioeconomy Development Opportunity Zone Initiative. So what does this do? So there's two main components here. The first item here is a certification and regional risk rating program that was developed by a consulting company, EcoStrat, in conjunction with the Department of Energy. This biomass supply chain risk standard. So really what they did is they got together with a whole bunch of people from financial institutions and Department of Energy, and a whole bunch, several hundred stakeholders were involved in surveys and conversations. And they have developed a risk rating tool, right? And you get a AAA, AA, single A, and so on rating out of this, really based on these three components down below, the three bullets. What is the available biomass supply in a community? Are there anchor suppliers that can contribute to low risk supply chains, not only today, but on into the future, right? If you're going to build a facility, you want to know that there's going to be long-term supply, right? And strong infrastructure to support plant operation. The reality is they built this tool because when you go to the finance industry, right, to do something in the biomass world, most people in the finance industry do not understand biomass. And so your risk associated with it and the cost of borrowing money goes up because there's perceived risk. What this tool is really developed is to put a number on that risk so financial institutions can make wise decisions, right, with knowledge and understanding. So that's one piece, is this de-risking of the supply chain. The other piece is making use of these federal opportunity zones. And so here's a map of New York State, right, showing where these designated federal opportunity zones, and there's all kinds of tax incentives for standing up new business operations, new facilities within these tax zones, right? So the idea is, where is there potential biomass supply where we could do one of these risk assessments in conjunction with one of these BDO, one of these opportunity zones, and combine them and turn it into a biomass opportunity zone, right? So if you're going to use one of these purple areas, it's not that all your biomass has to come from there, right? If your capital investment is within that purple zone, you could be drawing biomass from a radius around that. That's not the issue. The issue is where the capital investment is made to build the facility. So potential opportunities going forward in terms of where there might be some opportunities here to tie in and build out new facilities. There's more and more financial institutions getting behind this idea, right? And lots of money projected to flow into these BDO zones across the country. There are several, one in Canada out west that has been certified. There's projects in Arkansas and Georgia, and then I think out west in either Oregon or Washington that are underway of being certified through this process. Okay, so that's just an opportunity that going forward might be of interest to folks. Okay, so let me just wrap up with this slide. So what are the next steps? So John mentioned that we're going to do this wood-based bioeconomy. We've got the Wood Products Council put up some funding for this. We hope to launch this project later in the fall, right? Working through the state process of getting funds available. The idea is really to identify opportunities and challenges associated with a wood-based bioeconomy here in New York State. Okay, so I talked about different products. There's no preconceived notion of what those products are, right? Well, there's some ideas that people have, but there'll be lots of discussion about what are the best products that we need. So things like what Tristan just talked about, right? There's clearly going to be demand for biomass-based diesel fuel, right? So there's an opportunity that before the CLCPA may not have existed, right? Policy and laws have now changed that dynamic. There'll be lots of opportunity for engagement with stakeholders. So I'll be talking to John to come back and talk with you, but there'll be lots of other opportunities for folks all along the value supply chain to engage in this process and bring ideas and talk about barriers and opportunities, right? Strengths and weaknesses, so that together we can figure out what are the best opportunities to go after, right? We have a fair amount of biomass, but the reality is it is a limited amount of biomass, right? And how can we use that most effectively to build out the wood-based bioeconomy and grow industry here in New York State? So I will stop there. I'm happy to answer questions. My contact information is listed below. If you have other questions that we don't get to tonight or you want to chat, feel free to give me a call.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Colin and Tristan as well again. We'll open this to some questions and answers right now. I know the chat box has had a few things, and some of them were directed directly to Tristan, and you had indicated you've been monitoring that. So Tristan, I'll have you respond, and if anybody wants to raise a comment or have an additional question, put it in the chat, or do you all have the raise hand feature? And then Muriel can turn it on and we can have an open engagement here. So
Tristan is going to handle the first few, and then I have another one for Tim.
Great. Yeah, so there were two main ones that I saw, and so certainly let me know if I missed anything. And just to briefly recap what those were. So the first question that came in is asking, for some more information on the heating aspect, right? Talking about the transportation sector, obviously a lot of overlap between transportation and heating when you start talking about heating oil, but what's it look like for heating overall? And this is where building energy really becomes an important thing that the Climate Action Council is currently considering. And there is going to be a very crucial role for biomass in that. And there's really two main ways. The first one is the general expectation is that at some point, everyone is going to, or most people are going to be using air source heat pumps. And so this is the whole idea. You get, both heat and air conditioning in the summer via electricity rather than just getting air conditioning from electricity like most people currently do. And so that's right. Instead of using natural gas, instead of using heating oil, we'll be using electricity. The problem is, first of all, air source heat pumps, the technology is available, but it's expensive and it really hasn't achieved much market penetration yet. And even NYSERDA has done its own analyses, and even their most optimistic projection is that maybe 50% of the market will have been penetrated by 2030. Which again, that's very, very optimistic, but even that's not going to allow us to hit the state goals. And so there's going to need to be other sources of heat, especially lower carbon sources of heat that will need to be implemented, because that's 50% by 2030, which means you're not getting to 100% until well after that. And so there is going to be a role for that, whether that's going to be liquid fuels, which we currently see contributing to the bioheat mandate, or if we start talking about district heating systems, in upstate areas that are going to be using woody biomass. A lot of different potential applications there. The second one is downstate. And this is, I think, going to be the one that gets the most attention. I met with a leadership team at Con Ed a couple of months ago, and they had just conducted an analysis of what it's going to take for Manhattan or what Manhattan's going to look like once you have the CLCPA implemented. And it was really pretty startling what they found. Ultimately, they said that if you want to completely get rid of natural gas heat, which is what they're currently using in heating oil, and go complete electrification for heat, it is going to require Manhattan to quadruple the amount of electric distribution capacity that it has. Now, if you're ever to Manhattan, right, you don't see the electric lines because they're all buried underground. They're buried under the streets. There is enough to double at best the electric capacity down there, and they need to quadruple it if they're going to completely electrify all of their heat. So they're going to need to find other alternatives, right? This is going to be a major infrastructure hurdle that they're going to encounter. And so I don't know if that means taking forest residue from upstate, converting it to liquid fuels, and then because all of the natural gas-fired power plants in the Manhattan area are dual-fired for the most part, so that they can use liquid fuels in addition to natural gas. There's going to be a lot of opportunities there in the heating sector that we haven't necessarily thought about before. The second question gets into, okay, so what happens, with all of these industries that are going to be affected by the CLCPA, and what's the state's plan? Especially when you think about these are very, very ambitious targets. And so I can only speak for what has been stated at the Climate Action Council meetings and then at the advisory panels as well. But the general message that we have been receiving is that the state recognizes this is going to require the rapid deployment of new technologies. And so there is a certain contingent, especially downstate, the environmental groups who, would say, all right, if the logging industry wants to leave New York State, good riddance, right? Let them go. We don't like emissions. We don't like combustion of any type, right? They'd be perfectly fine with that. The good news is most members of the Climate Action Council recognize that is not feasible. And ultimately, it's not that you want to lose the industry or that you want to keep the industry, but even more than that, they don't see how we can hit these decarbonization targets without New York's forest industry. And so that's going to be where we really see a critical role played, like Tim was talking about. This is going to require new products. And so the state is currently drafting policies that will incentivize the conversion of things like forest residue ultimately to biomass-based diesel or to sustainable aviation fuel. And the general sense that we've been hearing from state policymakers is they want to see the CLCPA result in the creation of new industries in New York State that use biomass rather than driving out these existing industries that are already involved with the biomass sector. So again, it's not final yet, but I think by the time we see the Climate Action Council release its scoping plan in early 2022, what I'm told is that policymakers in the state expect the scoping plan to really serve as a signal to industry to start driving technological development in the biomass sector in particular.
I know that Charlie and Craig both had questions on this, and Muriel's allowed you to unmute yourselves and speak if you want to dig a little deeper. So Craig, do you have anything else you want to ask there?
No, I think he answered my question. I just wondered if these were so ambitious that it was just going to drive the industry out, including incentives. I wonder, I'm just speculating that the cost of this level of changeover for the industry is just going to be enormous, and just wondering how they're going to do it and still remain profitable when they could move over the, Dutchess Lumber could move a few miles south over the border to Pennsylvania and not have to make any changes at all. And others are probably in the same boat. So just curious what the thought was in terms of buy-in. Are they assessing that on the front end of all of this to see what level of cooperation they're going to get from industry, and not just the wood using industry in general?
I don't know if any of the panelists want to address that.
Well, and again, it's really at an early stage right now. We don't know which specific policies are going to be enacted, but I'll actually put this in the chat. You can see for the ag and forestry sector, which policy recommendations are being considered by the Climate Action Council right now. I'll warn you, there's over 100 of them. But if you're looking for, what we're specifically talking about, go to slides 91 through 104. These are the policy recommendations that were drafted with an intent of driving these types of developments. But, have a look at the entire thing, because again, it's the Ag and Forestry Advisory Panel. There is a lot in there that will show you what the Climate Action Council is considering in terms of what will directly affect the forestry sector.
And I think, as Tim mentioned, there's a clear recognition that we have to maintain the bioeconomy we have today in order to both facilitate some transition, as well as there's going to still be demand for those products. And the other thing that we've raised several times with the Climate Action Council, as well as the advisory panels, is, you're correct, Craig, some facilities could move state or out of country, but at the end of the day, that leakage, so to speak, only results in net carbon footprint increase in most instances, unless you're going to California or a few European countries, you're going to end up having a bigger carbon and greenhouse gas emission as well as environmental impact. And there are members of the council that are trying to take that seriously. There are also members that I think would just assume some what they refer to as polluting industries leave, not realizing they're just going to pop up somewhere else. Because the demand for harvested wood products across the economy is just going to increase over time. Colin?
I was just going to add that I think that when we talk about forests providing climate solutions, we talk about three strategies, right? So we talk about reforestation or afforestation, adding new forests. We talk about preventing the loss of forest land, right? Avoided deforestation. When we talk about changes in forest stewardship and management practices, that third one is very ambiguous and it's very context dependent. But I think the ability, particularly in some of what Tim and Tristan is talking about, is I think we all know they have a lot of low grade material in a lot of the forest lands across the state. This poses some real challenges in certain parts of the state in terms of lack of access to markets, and the bioeconomy offers some options to be able to help folks being able to work the land and maintain it as forest land. And this is a very critical issue, especially as we see increasing speculation on forest land for solar farms and other types of renewable energy development, particularly in the lower Hudson Valley. And so maintaining these markets, maintaining the industry and growing these is going to be essential, I think, to just maintaining forest land ownership. And we can't lose any forest land if we're going to get anywhere near achieving these goals. And so I think some of the politics around this are going to come up against that reality very quickly, or they should be. And I'll leave it at that. But without some solutions, we have a lot of forest land, but we have a lot of work in some areas to put it on a better trajectory, not just for carbon sequestration, but for lots of other goods and services and values that we have for that land. And if we take the other tack, we're going to lose a lot of forest land, I think, in the next 20 or 30 years, which is going to completely undermine, I think, any hope of meeting these goals.
So it looks like there was a follow-up question. Do you want me to tackle that real quick, John?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So a question about natural gas, and specifically renewable natural gas is starting to be deployed in New England. Is there a role for that here? And in this case, renewable natural gas from wood. I will just say that one of the ways New York is very different from California. California loves renewable natural gas. We've seen a massive industry develop very rapidly out there. New York, at least what we've seen on the Climate Action Council, is there is a strong bias against biogas, anaerobic digestion, renewable natural gas. The latest Climate Action Council meeting just a week or two ago, you actually had one of the Climate Action Council members, Peter Iwanowitz, explicitly say he wants to see anaerobic digestion made illegal in New York State. Now, I don't know that's actually going to happen because there is some support, especially when you start looking at the dairy industry. But I don't get the sense that the state would support converting wood to renewable natural gas, for the simple reason that renewable natural gas is primarily comprised of methane. And there is a strong concern, a very big concern about methane leakage in the state. So I think it would be far more likely you would see woody biomass converted to liquid fuels because you don't have to worry about methane. But as soon as you start talking about conversion to gaseous fuels, especially those involving renewable natural gas, those methane leakage concerns will probably prevent that from happening here.
We had one more question that was a little bit further up, and that was for Tim. Did you happen to see that in the chat? It was from Craig Bulmer.
I did. So Craig, the national numbers that I showed you, right, that model is fairly complex. And actually the forest model in those national numbers is, I think it's far too conservative, frankly. But the New York State numbers I showed you did include an estimate of percentage of the landowners or the land base in each township, actually, that would engage in forest management. So that's why the number is somewhere around 8 or 8.5 million dry tons a year, because there's much more potential out there, but we scaled it back down based on a model that estimated, actually it used road density was the best indicator of the engagement in forest management. So we did account for that in that New York State level data.
Yeah, that's, you know, one of the things we keep harping in on is landowners have a variety of stewardship values that they have out there for their forests. But at the end of the day, we know landowners are going to change. I mean, based on that National Woodland Owner Survey data for New York State, we have an extremely aging population of forest landowners, and probably over the next 20 years are going to see a massive turnover of significant parts of the forest. And who those next generation owners will be, how markets might drive investor decision-making into forest lands is going to be really interesting to watch. But one of the things we know, if we're go forward with many of these recommendations, keeping the forest as forest and also generating current and new forest products, harvested wood products, is going to grow significantly and increase market opportunity, we think. How that will resonate with existing and future forest landowners, it's going to be a hit or miss, I'm sure. I'm hoping that answered your question, Craig. Does anybody else have anything?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Craig.
I don't have any other questions in the chat
Okay.
or the Q&A.
Well, I know we are trying to wrap up by 8 p.m. We do have a couple of ESFPA business items that we need to get to, but the presenters have all given you their contact information. Feel free to reach out to them directly. I know they're very open and willing to talk to folks. And I do want to say that I think we will definitely work with Colin on a forest landowner, particularly large forest landowner conversation on his work and go into a little bit deeper dive on that stuff. So thank you, our panelists. You're welcome to stay on if you want to observe the rest of our meeting, or you can stay off. But any of the members on, we have a couple of business items to go for. So thank you, everyone. Mike, I don't know if you have anything you want to say last minute before everybody shifts.
Sure. Well, I will also just say thank you to Tim, Colin, and Tristan. I think that was a great presentation, and I'm sure, and even based on the questions, that our membership really enjoyed that. So thank you again for taking the time out of your evening to join us. Moving on then, I will quickly cover a bit of association business. Board governance and our bylaws have our executive or our board member terms slated at 3 years, and that's on a rotating basis. So every year, numerous board members' terms expire. At the end of this year, there was actually 6 board members that are terms are expiring. And so to address that, early in June, I created a nominating committee to go forth and determine what the status of those board members would be if they were interested in serving the board again, or if they had any other recommendations for new board members. They did that. They reported back to the board. We also sent a note to the membership asking if there was any other interest in individuals serving as board members. And so with that process complete, tonight I have 6 board members potential board members to present to you for election. Their terms would start this coming January and run for 3 years. 5 of those individuals that I'm putting forth as board members are currently board members whose terms expire, and that's Sarah Bogues, Doug Handy, Mike Hanlon, Charlie Niebling, and Jack Santamore. And the 6th potential board member I'm putting forth is new this year and has been gracious enough to join us if so elected, and that's Larry Richards. So these are the 6 board members, individuals I am suggesting that we elect to serve on the board for 3 years starting this January. But before I call for a motion, I will ask the membership who is on tonight whether there is any other names to put forth. And I will give you about 5 seconds, 5 to 10 seconds, if you could respond in the chat if there's any additional